gente não tem água, né? Bom, boa tarde. A gente vai começar a segunda sessão, a segunda mesa desse seminário. Certo, a gente vai começar então essa segunda mesa da sessão da tarde do seminário. Eu quero falar uma coisa que é para todo mundo, que é muito chato, mas é para todo mundo, e é que os horários do centro de convenções são hiper estritos. Então, seja o jeito que for, a gente tem que sair daqui às 5 horas da tarde. Porque senão eles multam o pago e, enfim, uma série de questões dessas. Só isso. Então, eu vou apresentar, então, a primeira pessoa que vai falar é Margarita. Margarita Chávez, colombiana, pesquisadora do Instituto Colombiano de Antropologia e História. Quero se apresentar mais? Enfim, uma das pessoas com maior trajetória de pesquisa na região do Putumayo, na fronteira sul da Colômbia, com trabalho com populações indígenas, com cidades, com economias de extração, trabalho enorme com território e mineração, com patrimônio. E, bom, Margarita, estamos muito felizes de te ter aqui. Bem-vinda. Por favor.
Saludos a todos y también mis agradecimientos al programa de estudios de género de esta universidad y a José Miguel y todo el equipo, Flavia, todo el equipo que ha hecho parte de este proyecto de investigación que hemos estado conociendo estos días y que ha sido muy interesante y con el cual también me he encontrado en otro tiempo. Yo voy a hacer una presentación que espero les genere un poco de interés en otras partes de otras regiones amazónicas y me voy a referir a una región amazónica en mi propio país, pero es una Amazonia que es un poco diferente a la Amazonia de la que hemos estado escuchando en estos días, porque es una Amazonia cuya principal frontera, pensaría yo, es la frontera andino-amazónica. Es una frontera es la región colombiana amazónica, pero que está conectada con el interior del país, o lo que en Colombia llamamos el interior del país, que es un interior andino. Las principales ciudades de Colombia están en la zona andina, y esta es una zona de transición, obviamente, hacia la selva amazónica. La presentación. Y también lo comento, mi trabajo, voy a tratar de hacer digamos, de pensar una perspectiva de frontera.
¿Es automático?
Yo no sé, me imagino. Sí. Una perspectiva de frontera que para mí también es nueva, porque José Miguel tenía mucho interés, puesto que Putumayo es una región que ha resentido la guerra y que en este momento está viviendo una situación muy particular de posconflicto o de posacuerdo. Quería que yo hablara sobre esta región. Putumayo es una región fronteriza en múltiples sentidos, como zona de transición entre los ecosistemas andinos y amazónicos, como frontera internacional entre estados nacionales, Colombia, Ecuador y Perú, como frontera de colonización para cientos de campesinos sin tierra y desempleados urbanos, y como frontera interétnica de entrecruzamientos étnicos. Su economía depende principalmente de la explotación de petróleo y del cultivo de la hoja de coca para su procesamiento en cocaína con destino al mercado mundial, y se caracteriza por actividades extractivas que reproducen la lógica de acumulación hacia afuera, en la que el capital nacional e internacional obtienen su máximo beneficio. Históricamente, el Estado en Putumayo se ha caracterizado por una mínima presencia institucional y una fuerte presencia militar que comunidades civiles y grupos armados desafían por diversos medios. En este contexto de violencia masiva, las mujeres han sido fuertemente afectadas, tanto en su integridad personal como en su base económica, el cultivo y procesamiento ilícito de coca. Y han sido afectadas por intervenciones directas e indirectas, armadas o represivas, del Estado colombiano en este escenario y por las de los ejércitos armados, que en este caso son el Ejército Nacional, la guerrilla de las FARC y los paramilitares en determinados momentos. Es decir, estamos en una región que tiene una fuerte dinámica de conflicto, narcotráfico y extractivismo petrolero, que ha generado un margen de estatalidad en el que las prácticas políticas, regulatorias y disciplinarias en juego reconstruyen permanentemente la frontera entre la legalidad y la ilegalidad. Y creo que mi centro va a ser un poco apuntando a preguntarnos por esta transición en el posconflicto que implica para esta frontera que marca tan fuertemente la vida de los pobladores de Putumayo. En la transición política que vivimos actualmente en Colombia, desde la firma del acuerdo de paz entre la guerrilla de las FARC y el Estado colombiano, la frontera que marca la posibilidad del fin de la guerra se ha hecho prominente en Putumayo. Y para darles una idea, esto quiere decir que hasta hace 3 años visitar para una persona como yo, llegar a Putumayo y llegar a las áreas rurales que tienen, por ejemplo, los poblados a los que se llega por el río, era imposible. O sea, había un riesgo muy alto. Y desde hace 2 años, cuando ya los diálogos estaban asentados, empezó a ser posible, realmente el clima de guerra bajó y en este momento hay casi que hasta un ambiente festivo. Se trata de una frontera política aún inestable, plagada de amenazas e incertidumbres en la situación de polarización política a favor y en contra del mismo proceso de paz, que no obstante deberá dar origen a una reorganización del escenario social y político regional en el que se proyecta la reconfiguración hegemónica del Estado colombiano por medio de la participación de diversos actores, muchos de los cuales hasta hace poco se pensaban como por fuera del marco de la legalidad. Mi pregunta para pensar esta presentación fue: ¿qué papel juegan las mujeres en esta reconfiguración de la frontera y de la soberanía estatal después de la firma de los acuerdos de paz? Expuestas al poder que han ejercido el Estado y la guerrilla en nombre de los respectivos órdenes, voluntades de poder y de gobierno, eminentemente masculinos, las mujeres juegan hoy un papel central en la reconfiguración del escenario político en el que se está replanteando cómo construir soberanía y dar paso al posconflicto. La pregunta sobre su lugar en el posacuerdo orienta mi presentación y la he dividido en 3 partes. La primera aborda el cruce de la economía informal e ilegal en el territorio del Putumayo. La segunda tiene que ver con las políticas estatales y las agencias gubernamentales que buscan dar respuesta a este tipo de economía. Y la tercera explicará la importancia del género para la reconfiguración de algo que yo quiero llamar aquí como soberanía interna. Si bien la pregunta interroga procesos políticos que aún no completan su primer año de vida, el desarme y la recomposición guerrillera se inició apenas en junio de este año. Identificar las posibles respuestas es urgente en términos de la reconciliación que era posible, la paz en Colombia. Bueno. Mi presentación, ¿por qué se centra en la economía informal y la economía ilegal? Me conocí a propósito con José Miguel cuando intentaba hacer una investigación sobre cómo caracterizar las ciudades amazónicas de esta frontera interna del país. Es una urbanidad muy ruralizada, es una urbanidad donde está muy presente la presencia de campesinos, pero es una urbanidad en términos del movimiento, de la concentración de gente, de las actividades económicas que allí se viven. en principio, cuando uno aborda como la ciudad quiere marcar entonces cuál es la diferencia entre este centro urbano y el área rural. Pero allí se va a encontrar que justamente esa frontera entre el centro, entre lo que llamamos urbano en esta ruralidad y lo rural, está permanentemente circulando debido a que la economía de la coca y el flujo que produce la economía de la coca es el que sostiene la economía urbana informal. Es decir, que el carácter ilícito del cultivo e ilegal de su procesamiento permiten construir un margen en todo sentido, en el lado rural y en el lado urbano, donde hay una permanente actualización del Estado para tratar de generar supuestamente un margen de legalidad que, sin embargo, lo que quiero mostrar es que él mismo lo alimenta. Me estoy refiriendo aquí a un margen digamos, ilegal que es muy contrastado con el que hablan algunos autores que trabajan, por ejemplo, la criminalidad o la ilegalidad en la frontera subsahariana o en el sur de Europa, como Beatriz Ibú o Janet Royman. En este caso estamos hablando de una ilegalidad que está ligada a la implantación de una economía que desde hace 40 años ha servido para fortalecer ejércitos irregulares, pero también ha sostenido económicamente a la población de esta región. Y que el procesamiento y esta economía es tan fuerte que lo que uno encuentra cuando empieza a indagar en el medio urbano es que todo el mundo le dice, aquí directa o indirectamente todos nos favorecemos de la economía de la coca. Entonces, la economía de la coca empieza en un área rural con el cultivo, es un cultivo intenso que demanda una fuerte participación de mano de obra, que la hay en Putumayo, sobre todo en las épocas de cosecha y de limpia del cultivo. Después entra una fase de procesamiento, después una fase de transporte, después una fase de comercio y luego sale al tráfico, que es el que produce las mayores ganancias para la gente que ya no es, digamos, la población local. En 2000, por ejemplo, en Putumayo, en esta región, se ubicaba el 40% de los cultivos de coca de Colombia y el 63% de los cultivos que había en la región amazónica. O sea, eso es para darles una idea de qué tan extendido está el cultivo de hoja de coca. Y desde esos años en que el cultivo se expandió mucho y que la guerrilla también obviamente se fortaleció gracias a la regulación que ella hacía del cultivo, se impuso una política antinarcóticos con el apoyo de los Estados Unidos que fue tremendamente drástica con la población local. Fue la política que se llamó Plan Colombia, una inversión muy alta en programas de erradicación de coca, erradicación forzada por medio de fumigación aérea, también de erradicación manual, que comprendía algunas políticas de desarrollo que infortunadamente nunca llegaron a los pobladores y se quedaron en manos de intermediarios que bien eran o agencias no gubernamentales que adelantaban los programas de desarrollo o los mismos comerciantes que debían trasladar, digamos, semillas, insumos para reemplazar supuestamente la producción de coca. Esto pues tiene por resultado un fortalecimiento de ejércitos irregulares que entran a dominar esta economía. Los dos, digamos, las FARC entran a regular, digamos, cantidad de producción, pagos cumplidos y obviamente ya imponer un impuesto sobre la población campesina que la población campesina acepta como de alguna manera una especie de paraestado que permite que haya una cierta mínima normalidad en una economía que es ilegal, hasta el año 2000 también, cuando entran los paramilitares a competir por territorio y por el negocio de la coca con las FARC. Estos son los años más terribles de la guerra en Colombia. Se empieza a generar las más altas tasas de desplazamiento forzado dentro del país y obviamente es el periodo de más alta urbanización en la región de estudio. Se puede decir que las 13 cabeceras municipales que además están conectadas obviamente por carreteras terrestres que van hacia el interior del país, tienen un crecimiento altísimo de gente que busca protección, mínima protección estatal en estas zonas de urbanización, pero el margen de alguna manera de seguridad todavía es mínimo porque la gente, a pesar de la tremenda represión, sigue sosteniéndose gracias al cultivo de coca. Entonces, para estudiar una economía urbana que tiene esta frontera entre lo rural y lo urbano, que es muy porosa, que es permanentemente aceitada por gente que está en la ciudad pero va a cosechar hoja de coca, gente que tiene parientes que tiene cultivos de coca. La reinversión de los cultivos de coca se hace en la ciudad, o sea, es permanente mantenida. Yo empecé a ver qué hacía la gente en las ciudades, en la ciudad en Putumayo, qué procesos había, y encontré más o menos que el ciclo económico urbano consiste en 3 actividades: el rebuscar, el prever y el consumir y el prever. Las 3 actividades estaban muy aceitadas por la coca, pero además por las políticas estatales. Entonces, todas estas actividades del rebuscar que yo empecé diciendo, ¿qué hacían? ¿Qué hace la gente para rebuscar? Y encontré que las actividades eran muy variadas. Ventas callejeras, ventas por catálogo, transporte en motocicleta, muchos vendiendo carreras de moto, venta de comidas callejeras. Toda además era gente que se inscribía en 2 políticas estatales muy fuertes. Por una parte, la política de atención a las víctimas del conflicto armado. El 60% de la población de Puerto Asís, que tiene una población en la cabecera municipal de 35.000 personas aproximadamente, y con el área rural de más o menos unas 60.000 personas, de esas 35.000 personas, el 70% estaba inscrita en el plan, las políticas de víctimas, y además, digamos que el 80% de la población estaba inscrita en la otra política muy fuerte del Estado colombiano, que es las transferencias monetarias condicionadas. Esta política de transferencias comenzó, si quieren, en los años del Plan Colombia, que son las transferencias directas de dinero, pero por primera vez en esta época las transferencias la gente las administra en lo que quiere. Se supone que están condicionadas, como creo que Flavia lo presentó, a la alimentación y la salud de los escolares y de los niños que están al cuidado de las madres, pero las madres las reinvierten en todos los negocios que alimentan la informalidad. Entonces, allí hay que tener mucho cuidado con pensar realmente qué pasa con la economía informal. De hecho, uno ve que pues muchos dineros del Estado pasan a esta economía, y pues es muy difícil pensarse en separar la frontera entre la informalidad y la formalidad. Entonces, si ven, vamos con que rural y urbano es una frontera tremendamente porosa y móvil, informal y legal también, porque está aceitado por la formalidad de los recursos del Estado. Y efectivamente, la otra política, esta podríamos decir que son las políticas zanahoria, la del garrote sigue siendo la reactivación permanente, cíclica de las políticas de erradicación del Estado colombiano. Ellas también han sido causantes de una tremenda movilidad del área rural a la urbana. Son conocidas por la gente como pues realmente la mayor amenaza. A veces más que, es sorprendente, pero cuando uno habla con la gente en la región, muchas veces más que la amenaza de un cuerpo armado, era el erradicador o la fumigación. Sentir que estaban las avionetas que iban a fumigar los cultivos, porque esto atentó contra también los cultivos de comida, la salud de la gente. Uno de los mayores problemas de salud que hay en la región tiene que ver con problemas de salud derivados del glifosato. Entonces, ¿y qué ha pasado con estas 2 últimas políticas estatales, la de víctimas y la de transferencias condicionadas? Y aquí quiero empezar a hacer un poco del análisis de cómo esto conecta con escenarios que no solo están en Putumayo, que es una región muy particular donde se experimenta esta situación de guerra, sino que pueden estar en muchas otras partes y que tiene que ver obviamente con el régimen neoliberal imperante en las políticas estatales de muchos países y de muchas regiones. Esta política de las transferencias condicionadas hay quienes las ven como realmente balas contra la pobreza, pero tienen una carga de asistencialismo muy fuerte que solo en la medida, digamos, en que interviene una agencia femenina muy fuerte por volverlas otra cosa, también puede volverse un recurso. Ellas están administradas a veces no directamente por el gobierno, sino que entran muchas empresas intermediarias, ONG sobre todo, que tienen a su cargo, por ejemplo, el programa que cubre a los ancianos, la política focalizada para los jóvenes. La de las mujeres es la única que administra principalmente el Estado. Y la otra tiene que ver con la de víctimas, que este es el caso todavía más dramático, donde lo que se ha impuesto aquí es un sistema de construcción de una base de datos y un sistema de información impresionante del Estado para tratar de ubicar a las poblaciones, pero como las categorías focalizadas de política permanentemente están haciendo que la gente busque la mayor posibilidad de inscripción en ellas, estas políticas entonces están oscilando, siempre tienen una amenaza de que se van a depurar las cifras, se tiene que depurar las cifras de víctimas, se tienen que depurar el número de familias inscritas en los programas de transferencias, porque los recursos efectivamente, pues la gente trata de inscribirse en todo, pues esta es una región que recibe muy poca atención de parte del Estado. ¿Qué pasa en el posconflicto? Desde que se firmó el acuerdo de paz en Putumayo, se crearon 2 zonas de transición de guerrilleros a, digamos, la civilidad, en lo que se conocen como zonas veredales de transición. En esas zonas veredales de transición, en estos más o menos 5 meses desde la firma del acuerdo, un poco más, porque ellos empiezan a llegar a esas zonas un poco más temprano, el Estado ha tenido que traspasarles recursos para la construcción de las casas. Yo quería presentarles un video que no lo trajimos, que es justamente filmado en Puerto Asís, que es la zona donde estoy trabajando, que muestra justamente cómo se está formando de alguna manera una especie como de pequeño poblado, no es la ciudad, no es una vereda, ya es un principio de entrada, es una instalación de un principio de urbanización en el que la gente está esperando la siguiente transferencia de recursos. La desmovilización en este momento, en una región donde la producción, donde la economía depende del petróleo, cuyo flujo va directamente al Estado, y la coca, que va por abajo y nutre toda la, digamos, la escala de la economía local. En este momento, la transferencia que se espera para la reinserción de todos estos excombatientes es más o menos un promedio de $600 mensuales por excombatiente por 2 años, más un monto aproximado de, déjame calcular, más o menos $3.000 como base de una actividad que debe volverse lucrativa en un plazo de 2 años, donde no hay efectivamente todavía ni mercados, ni carreteras, ni los recursos que hagan posible realmente la reinserción. Uno se pregunta, bueno, ¿y entonces qué va a pasar? Y aquí viene mi punto sobre las mujeres. Y sorprendentemente, desde la firma del acuerdo, en Puerto Asís se han realizado 2 encuentros de mujeres, de organizaciones de mujeres. Estas son organizaciones, por ahí circula una fotografía donde aparecen las víctimas, los monumentos que ellas hacen en las cabeceras municipales sobre, mira, esa. Esto es lo que ellas hacen con los nombres de mujeres que fueron asesinadas en el más alto periodo de violencia, y esto hay en distintas cabeceras municipales. O sea, la conciencia femenina de cómo la guerra las ha afectado tremendamente a ellas, también las ha empujado en una fuerte fuertemente hacia la organización política. En Putumayo se reunieron recientemente 30 organizaciones femeninas que trataron de, examinaron y se pronunciaron frente a al punto 4 de los acuerdos de paz, que es el que tiene que ver con la economía de la coca y con la política de erradicación de cultivos de coca. Ellas en este documento, que es muy interesante, plantean, entre otras cosas, que algo que es absolutamente subversivo, y si la economía de la coca ha sido una economía subversiva en este país, en esta región, en manos de los pobladores, no me refiero al narcotráfico, al tráfico, que nunca hay políticas para controlar el tráfico. La política se hace para controlar la producción en la base. Es que ellas piden no se criminalice la labor de los cocaleros. Y piden que además el acuerdo no solo descriminalice a las cultivadoras y a los cultivadores de la hoja de coca, sino que incluya a quienes raspan, a quienes transforman, a quienes transportan y a quienes venden la coca localmente. En este momento hay una tremenda oposición por parte de la Fiscalía a que se escuche la voz de las mujeres y una tremenda accionar político de ellas por tratar de salir a la luz pública por redes sociales, por prensa alternativa, haciendo escuchar, de manera que ellas les dicen, la consigna es, porque las mujeres colombianas, incluyen la nación, nos oponemos a cualquier guerra, incluida la de las drogas. Y también, que es increíble, porque dicen, porque la tarea de la paz le quedó grande a los hombres. Esas son las dos consignas de ellas. Lo que a mí me parece que hay en este momento es una reconstrucción de las nociones de soberanía, en dos sentidos. El primero tiene que ver con una fuerte agencia de la sociedad civil como sociedad política, en el mismo sentido en que lo propone Partha Chatterjee, en el que la base, que no ha tenido nunca derechos, no puede constituir sociedad civil, porque ha estado al margen de los derechos ciudadanos. Todo lo que ha recibido del Estado es fumigación y guerra. Entonces, ellas se constituyen como agencias políticas de demanda principalmente y de desafío en los discursos a los desafíos de las políticas estatales, y por otra parte desafían como que la frontera de la soberanía solo es posible si realmente incluye la posibilidad de extender voz y espacio político a estas voces que retratan como ellas realmente algo que nadie enuncia, y es realmente la afectación que puede tener que se criminalice a los que están en otra etapa de la producción de coca que no sea la del cultivo. Y ellas están de alguna manera resignificando qué es lo legal y qué es lo ilegal. Ellas casi nunca hablan de legalidad e ilegalidad, ellas hablan de lícito e ilícito. Y ellas dicen que todas estas fases en las que entra la producción de hoja de coca son actividades lícitas, porque si no fuera por ese cultivo, ellas ya hubieran, pues no habrían tenido con qué sostener sus familias, ni ellas mismas, y reproducir sus vidas. O sea que este sigue siendo un margen que reproduce. Históricamente Putumayo ha sido, se usa una frase en Colombia que habla de ciudadano de quinta categoría, y ellas más o menos lo que están reclamando es: queremos realmente no ser de quinta categoría, queremos tener espacio político, y tenemos que la única posibilidad de que los acuerdos hagan posible la paz es incluyendo a las mujeres, que son las que han sido tremendamente afectadas por la guerra. Muchas gracias.
Margarita, muito obrigado. Muito obrigado também pelo tempo. Só um pouquinho. Eu preciso fazer uma coisa aqui. Tá. Muito obrigado. A seguinte apresentação, então, vai ser da professora Caitlin Stout, que é professora de ciência política e professora de estudos de política comercial hemisférica ocidental, que está na faculdade desde 1977, supervisiona estagiários e ensina cursos sobre políticas públicas, fronteiras, democracia, liderança e envolvimento cívico. Em 2008, ela recebeu o Prêmio de Inovação em Ensino da UT Chancellor, dos dois de Texas. Os interesses de pesquisa, mais de 100 artigos publicados, diversos livros ao redor da fronteira, ativismos de resistência na fronteira, principalmente de mulheres. É professora na Universidade del Paso, em Texas. É ativa em organizações comunitárias e comitês locais sem fins lucrativos. Em maio de 2015, foi palestrante de uma conversa TEDx em El Paso, e em agosto de 2015 ela falou no Borders Summit. Ela atuou no Conselho de Administração Global da Associação de Estudos de Fronteiras de 2014 a 2016. O mais recente livro se chama Border Politics in the Global Era, yeah. Comparative Perspective. Então, Caitlin, bem-vinda. Welcome and thank you very much.
Thank you. Obrigada. Thank you, Jose Miguel, Flavia, and all of those responsible for coordinating this wonderful conference. As far as I know, this is the first international conference on gender in the borderlands in the entire world. And so you are all to be congratulated for this pioneering achievement. My presentation is going to be a little bit different from the others in that I am going to provide a kind of a panorama of my research over the last 20 years or so, just sharing some of the findings, not all of the details, not all of the findings, but showing you my transition from a woman studying women and violence against women in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands to someone who studies gender in the borderlands and in multiple regions of the world. Yeah, I'll pass it, yes. I have lived in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands for 40 years, and so I have long considered the U.S.-Mexico borderlands to be the center of the world. So much research has been done in the area, and as I attend the Association of Borderland Studies meetings every year, and occasionally the world meetings, which happen every 5 years, I am more and more impressed about how important it is for us to compare borderlands around the world. I only have one map in my presentation, and this has a kind of political edge to it. Because in the United States, we are so concerned about the wall, Trump's demands that Mexico pay for the wall, and so on. And in this semi-humorous map, there is the saying, Mexico agrees to pay for Donald Trump's border wall, but using original borders. And this refers to a comment that Norma made the other day when she reminded everyone, as I will remind you as well, that Mexico lost half of its territory to the United States in 1848 and 1953. And there are some who study, for example, Oscar Martinez, how would Mexico be different now had it maintained its entire territory? With San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, with the deep ports, with riverways, and so on. Mexico would surely be a different place than what it is now. Because as you learned this morning, the U.S.-Mexico borderlands is a place of power asymmetry and huge inequalities. This is a map, keep this in mind, and remember that Norma and I are located right at the northern part of what is now Mexico. It's 2,000 miles long, more than 3,000 kilometers long. Why should we study the borders of identity or borderlands of territory, borders in space? Well, I am going to focus on territorial borders. And I am not going to go over all of these details because I think yesterday afternoon, everybody who presented did a wonderful job defining gender, defining borders, and emphasizing how much both gender and borders are social constructions. They're not natural, they're not man-made, they are the result of politics and of the use of power in space. I am going to emphasize how important it is to study borders with a gender perspective to generate greater knowledge, deeper knowledge than what we had. Remember, being 40 years in political science in the borderlands, I was part of a discipline, political science, that was extremely male-dominated, where the men who dominated the discipline did not read much work by women. They did not cite it. They did not think that research about women or violence against women was even important. So it took women in this and several other disciplines, after a great struggle, it was their responsibility in a way to finally provide deeper knowledge of the experiences that we might call gender in borderlands. I'm going to illustrate my work in several different themes: the gendered violence, women and men, but always trying to create linkages with class and ethnicity and nationality. I am also going to talk about economic apartheid at the border, at the U.S.-Mexico border. Now, some of you might think that the word apartheid is a very strong word, as it is, because it refers to what happened in South Africa before 1944, when when apartheid totally racialized inequality and opportunity in that land. And there is some similar activity that even goes on in the U.S.-Mexico borderland. Strict border controls, extremely low-cost labor on the Mexico side of the border, and business people from both countries touting the advantage of what they call global competitiveness. Global competitiveness. This is always the phrase I hear from the big business community. I'll also talk a bit about the rule of law and lawlessness and some of the ways that bodies have become very vulnerable in the borderlands, particularly state intrusiveness into bodies in some very private ways. I'll talk a bit about migration and citizenship, and then I would like to close with what is hopefully more optimistic and inspiring themes about the ways that people resist the border and border lines and the active agency of many people when they are engaged in social activity at the border. So first, let me say a few words about my book it's an older book, it's from 2008, Violence and Activism at the Border, Gender, Fear, and Everyday Life in Ciudad Juarez. And this is a book that I talked about briefly on Tuesday when some of the students were making presentations. I want to emphasize how my work on this research began with activity in the community, specifically with a transborder, I will defer to Norma here, a transborder coalition on violence against women and families at the border. And the activism, especially on the side of Ciudad Juarez, was very effective. It was very dramatic, as you see from the picture of the cover. Many marches, rallies, and so on, very high-profile activity covered by the media. And you might say, why? It's because Ciudad Juarez became known as the site of a much-contested term called feminicidio. I didn't invent the word. People in Ciudad Juarez used the word, particularly the mothers, the feminists, and the human rights activists. Why did they use the word feminicidio? Because if one measures over time the number of murdered women found in the desert, between 1993 and 2003, there were 370 women. as documented by activists, in newspaper reports, by the government itself, and also by Amnesty International. We had international non-government organizations that became very involved and very engaged in what was going on. With all the talk about feminicidio and my activism in the organization, I became interested in other kinds of questions, like how much of the murder was the result of predators, criminals, people who were targeting strangers, strange women, and then kidnapping them, taking them into the desert, doing terrible things to them, and leaving their bodies in the desert, and how much of it was what we have normalized in so many countries as domestic violence murder. In fact, even the term domestic violence seems to undermine the horrors of living in an intimate relationship with someone who either engages in domestic violence or takes it a few steps further to actually kill their intimate partner. So my pathway into this project was to become involved with a big non-government organization in Ciudad Juarez that has health clinics all over the city and that does applied research. Together, in a collaboration, we were able to apply for some grant money to be able to do 400 interviews of women aged 15 through 39 with a representative sample of women. I want to emphasize here, as I will in other places, that I often use for my methodology mixed methods. Why do I use mixed methods? I'm in political science. I'm in a discipline where there is far greater respect and far greater credibility given to research that has numbers analyzed within it. So I often participate as a participant observer, or I am closely observant in an ethnographic style, but I try also to build numbers into the research. So we had this large survey. We did some quasi-experimental research where the NGO in Ciudad Juarez was able to do workshops with half of the sample and the other half, and we made before and after comparisons. All these methodologies that often will create opportunities for publication, because those of you going into academia may know that your long-term success depends on publications in peer-reviewed journals. I already had many of those, but I wanted to make sure that the work got published and got out. What were some of the findings? Well, there were many findings. Women were very aware of the feminicidio. They were very aware of the laws that were supposed to be enforced, but they really weren't enforced very effectively because the police in Ciudad Juarez did not give a high priority to violence against women. Through the surveys, we also found out that a huge proportion, 75% of people in the sample, did not trust the police when asked questions like, if you experience physical violence from your partner, what would you do, where would you go? You know, very few of them would even contact the police, because in Ciudad Juarez at that time, contacting the police might mean that you would create even worse problems for yourself. So we asked in other ways, do you trust the police? Very few people trust the police. So what was the result of some of this? Well, the government is always somewhat of a genius in trying to divide and rule. And by 2005 and 2006, the government, in collaboration with some of the big business in Ciudad Juarez, was making it seem as though the NGOs and the social movements were undermining the city. Were causing some of the factories to move to China and matters like this. So there was a bit of a lull in the anti-violence movement for a while, but in the meantime, there was some activity taking place within the state. For example, other researchers found that in the Federal Attorney General's office, there were committees set up to look at what was called gender-based violence. This word gender, right? the word gender was being used deep inside the state. I'm not sure it made all that much of a difference, but another result is that several states in Mexico passed laws in their state legislatures against feminicidio, and feminicidio became a crime. You know, before this, hominicidio, men, you know, the murder of men, in a way stood for the murder of all people. So there were groups in Mexico that said, we want to make sure that people, that not only do we count the number of murders of men and women, but we make feminicidio a crime in the state. Would this work in the United States? Probably not, because you know, I have colleagues who are lawyers who work in the district attorney's office, and prosecuting a crime, a murder called a hate crime, is very difficult because hate is difficult to prove. You could have a woman's body that was stabbed 50 times. Can the attorneys prove that it was hate? That it was motivated by hate, which is something that misogyny and feminicidio often imply. So my colleagues who are attorneys say that it is better to simply have evidence-based activity in prosecuting a murder rather than trying to call it a hate crime. Another stage of my research is present in a book that I co-authored with my colleague, Dr. Zulma Mendez, who is an educational anthropologist, but importantly is someone who is very involved in the, what we called in the book, the second stage of anti-violence activism, anti-feminicidio activism. This, as I said, referred to a quieter time in Ciudad Juarez when there were feminist lawyers who took the case to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. It always takes courts a long time to process cases that are brought before it, but after a year, they made a judgment about 3 of the young girls who were killed and their bodies were found inside the city, buried in shallow graves. The court declared that the Mexican government, the state, was responsible for not investigating and prosecuting crimes. So this was a great achievement. The second stage of this activism was a stage in our analysis where we found that women and mothers, mothers of disappeared daughters, mothers of kidnapped daughters, mothers of murdered daughters, were leading the way in broadening the base of resistance to not only the violence, the anti-women violence, but also to the militarization that was going on both sides of the border. The U.S. and Mexico began, especially under the Felipe Calderón administration, to militarize the border, often with help from the United States, technology and armaments and so on. This was an important book, and this is a book that I'm leaving in the library just like the other book. I think you can see it out there. Courage, Resistance, and Women in Ciudad Juarez, Challenges to Militarization. And the importance of this book is partly related to something that Margarita said about the importance of historical memory. It's all too easy for people to forget how difficult it is to challenge the state, especially a militarized state, and women and other groups began to challenge the official narrative of the Mexican state, saying that everything was going to be all right. Don't worry. There was a period of very high violence, 2008 to 2012, and in 2010, the President Calderón, in the third year of his administration, finally came to Ciudad Juarez to make it seem as though everything was okay, don't worry, we're taking care of it. He had sent military troops and federal police to Ciudad Juarez, who were all over the city and made the city feel like an occupied territory. It felt like a war zone. There were checkpoints in the downtown of Ciudad Juarez. And so 2010 was a very, very frightening time period. It was very intimidating with all the guns and people in uniforms, plus criminal organizations that were not really being prosecuted. And so how do we make sure to memorialize and historicize this important work of activists who are challenging the state? This is what Zulma and I tried to do in the book. And just to give you a sense of what was happening, one of the turning points was a mother who was, thanks to the activists and their creativity, snuck into a very fancy center in Ciudad Juarez where President Calderon was speaking, and she got up and people were videotaping, and she openly challenged him and insulted him. She was a maquiladora worker. She continues to be that. 2 of her sons were killed in a horrible, brutal slaying of 15 or 16 teenagers in Ciudad Juarez. So she simply got up and challenged him right in his face and said, "You say these things, you're not doing anything, we don't believe you anymore." And it seemed to spark a lot of courage on the part of many other people. So we focused on her, we focused on several other women, several mothers. One of them was a horribly tragic case. The daughter had been killed. The husband confessed to the killing, even confessed to where he had dismembered the body and put it in a garbage area, and still he wasn't prosecuted for the crime. So the mother of this murdered daughter and her son were searching for the killer, and finally the mother was assassinated, probably with the okay from the state governor. Nobody knows for sure, but probably with the help of criminal organizations in the state of Chihuahua. So anyway, this is a book that we want to credit women leaders as leading the way toward a broadened social movement activity in Ciudad Juarez that involved also organizations that were led by men. Because before this, the anti-feminicidio, the anti-violence movement had mainly been a woman's movement. And because of it being a women's movement, many people said, "Oh, it's just the women. It's just the women, you don't need to pay that much attention to them." But once the movement began to be broadened with anti-militarization people, it took on a different form. Was this difficult? Was it challenging? Yes, indeed it was. Because there were sometimes different organizing styles by men and women, and there were sometimes struggles within these different coalitions and alliances over their work. But they were able to challenge the official narrative and take the narrative that had been developing at the grassroots among the social movement organizations and create a new kind of narrative about what was going on in Ciudad Juarez. So that was another part of my evolution. But let me now, in my last 10 minutes, talk about another stage of, another part of my research that does go back to the 1990s. And it looks at the issue of economic inequalities in the borderlands, which I earlier called apartheid. This is an area where, I always want people to understand that there is a tenfold difference in the legal minimum wages that are paid to people. Even though, as Norma was saying, parts of Ciudad Juarez, parts of northern Mexico are dollarized. The cost of living is higher than one might imagine, yet people are paid as little as $4 to $5 US per day, not per hour. And so in the 1990s, I was very interested in, well, even in the 80s, very interested in the maquiladoras. I don't know if you have them at the Brazilian borders, maybe you will in 10 or 20 years, but it's where a more powerful country with more capital sets up factories to do assembly line work on the other side of the border, and then develops policies so that the goods can be imported without having to pay high tariffs on them. And so this is what had happened in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. And in the beginning stages wages of the export assembly factories that were developing. 80% of the labor was female labor. This labor force became more gender balanced by the late 1980s, and actually the wages of men began to be quote-unquote feminized, as some people call it, lowered because they were doing women's work, as it might have been described earlier. Now, my interest in this book called Free Trade with a question mark, and mind you, the book was published just a few years after NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was signed. My interest was in looking at informal economies, just as Margarita has also talked about, because there's because a tremendous amount of livelihood is maintained by people working outside of the regulated economy. And Mexico and researchers there have long recognized it, but the United States treats informal work as crime or tax evasion. And so I was able to get some I was able to apply for some grant funding from something called the National Science Foundation, the NSF, which in the United States is a really, really good agency to get money from. And so just like the work you're doing with young researchers in the state, the funding allowed us to hire about 15 undergraduate students who were paid a half-time wage, more than minimum wage, a half-time wage, in order to learn about survey research and in order to actually do the research. So here again, we used mixed methods. We generated a sample of 600. We had to map neighborhoods. We had to take random samples. But we wanted to do all of this to be able to publish the work and to make sure people viewed the work as credible. I think the business community in El Paso viewed this work as an embarrassment to all of the global competitiveness that they wanted to project. But in any case, we had our NSF scholars, the students. Some of the major findings from the study is that people in Ciudad Juarez who did informal work through crossing the border, because the border can be viewed as an opportunity, not just a barrier, but when they crossed the border, they were able to make 3 times more per week than people who worked in the maquiladoras, people who worked in the export processing factories. However, people who didn't cross the border and worked informally, the women especially, were the worst off of all categories. They were doing things like ironing for other people or serving as maids on the Ciudad Juarez side of the border. So now I am going to, oh, and by the way, there's a fantastic book that I would recommend by a Dutch scholar. I learned about this when I was doing research on the India-Bangladesh border. Willem van Schendel and Itzi Abraham, Illegal but Licit, they focus on illegal but licit trade. And that's exactly what I was focusing on in this project. This informal work wasn't hurting anybody. It was technically illegal because people weren't paying taxes and people weren't paying for licenses and fees. In this book and also in my work, I have tended to view the government or the state as just trying to extract as much revenue as it can from local populations. So it looks as though I won't be able to finish everything, but I did want to say something about the latest book. This is a picture that I took crossing my borderlands from El Paso to Ciudad Juarez. I crossed the pedestrian bridge. There's some wonderful art and graffiti as I look through the chain link fence. And I loved that someone had painted something, "No Berlin Wall." Because I think we have to recognize how these borders are oftentimes barriers, not because of the people who live there, but because of what governments do with borderlines. So that became the picture for this book that I'm also going to leave at the library here. And so this is a kind of a culmination of my work from women to gender, from one borderland to the rest of the world. In very, very brief form, I will tell you that in this research, I was able to do the kinds of things that many in border studies don't do. The Association of Borderland Studies, even though people claim to be border researchers, they're often state-centric researchers. They're looking at what the government does to the border. I was interested in not only including my work, but also work from other borderlands locations from a borderlands perspective. So I have in this book, after the historical and the map-making section, I have 4 chapters on 4 borderlands around the world. One of them, of course, the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, another, the German-Polish borderlands, and then another one, the India-Bangladesh border. And I must thank colleagues in those places and thank them for their research, for helping to illuminate for me what those borderlands were like and how the often extensive inequalities at the borderlands might be reduced, either through government redistribution or through non-government organization activity. And so in this book, I not only look at 3 land borderlands, but I also have a chapter on maritime borders, namely in East Asia. And my colleagues in Japan are very, very interested in the maritime borders, the South China Sea, the discovery of new islands, which will allow countries to claim extraterritorial rights over the minerals and other resources that might be in the sea. So I have chapters on 4 borderlands. I have chapters on 3. Oh, there's my timer for 30 minutes. 2 minutes, please. I have 3 chapters on policy issues. I have a chapter on film. And the chapter on film analyzes 40 borderlands films, but interestingly, none of them have the word border or borderlands in the title. So you have to watch as many films as I do in order to really find these films and identify them. Similarly, the title of this book, Border Politics in a Global Era, you would never know that there's a lot of material in here about gender and women, but there is. And I took these little blue sticky marks to show you just how many places I have paragraphs and pages on gender and gender analysis in these different borderlands. Why do I do this? Again, it's my peculiar discipline. They won't read it if it has the word gender or women in the title. I want this book to be read by people who study international politics, comparative politics, world politics, et cetera, et cetera. So I could say more, but I will stop here. I have some really gross things I could tell you about what the U.S. government does to bodies crossing the border, but I will stop here in case there are questions about that later. Thank you so much.
Oi. Caitlin, thank you very much. Ok, a continuação, então, vamos com a apresentação da professora Kamala Kempadu. Kamala Kempadu é professora do Departamento de Ciências Sociais da Universidade de York, no Canadá, afiliada à Associação de Estudos da América Latina e do Caribe. Ela também é vinculada aos programas de pós-graduação em estudos de gênero, feminismo e de mulheres, ciência política, pensamento social e político e estudos de desenvolvimento. Ela é diretora do programa de pós-graduação em pensamento social e político da Universidade de York. Viveu e trabalhou na Grã-Bretanha, Holanda, Estados Unidos e vários países do Caribe holandês e de língua inglesa e desde 2002 no Canadá. Áreas de especialização: feminismos transnacionais e caribenhos, discursos de tráfico de seres humanos, estudos de relações de trabalho econômicas sexuais, estudos negros, estudos caribenhos e gênero e desenvolvimento. Diversas publicações em livros e capítulos e uma influência muito grande há muitos anos no núcleo de estudos de gênero PAGU. Então, Kamala, thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here, Jose Miguel. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I know it's a long day, it's the last session, so hopefully I'll get through this quickly and we can have some discussion. I got a little sick last night, so if I cough a bit, I'm a bit fuzzy in the head, but bear with me. This is not, the borderlands is not really my area of research. In fact, I know Jose Miguel through the work that he and I both do on sex work and anti-trafficking discourses. And, but I'm also going to be talking about a project that is a cross-border project in the Guyanas today. So that is going to be my intervention in this conference. But really my specialization is, my research specialization is really on anti-trafficking discourses. And I'd like to just point out that we have a new journal issue that I edited with Jose Miguel's work as well as my own, some new work on anti-trafficking. He has a piece in here analyzing the anti-trafficking discourse in Tabatinga. So it's related to the work that you've been hearing about that he's been doing. And we have a couple copies outside if people are interested in purchasing it, but it's also one that I'm going to leave with Pagu. It's just out, so it came out from a conference panel we did a couple of years ago. Yes, 2 years ago, and it's really focused on the Caribbean, discourses in the Caribbean, Central America and South America, from very critical perspectives. So this presentation is about the collaborative, transnational, and cross-border work that I'm doing with 2 universities in the Guyanas on gender studies, the universities of Guyana and Suriname, and 3 universities in Canada, in Toronto, through which we're building a teaching and research